In 1177, the Kingdom of Jerusalem wasn't just facing an external threat, it was rotting from within. Strategic context is everything. King Baldwin IV had been diagnosed with leprosy. To his enemies, he was a curse. To his court, he was a political dead end. Worse, the kingdom's field army was gone, campaigning in the north, leaving the southern gates wide open. Saladin saw this vacuum. He didn't just see a sick boy on a throne, he saw a golden opportunity to erase the Crusader states forever. 26,000 men began their march. The propaganda of the era said Jerusalem was already lost. The stage was set for a slaughter, but Saladin made one mistake. He underestimated the Ghost King. He waited for the exact moment the kingdom's guard was down. His host was a nightmare made of sand and steel, 26,000 light horse, supported by his elite Mamluk guard. He knew the Crusader field army was far to the north. Jerusalem was a city of ghosts, defended by a boy king and a handful of knights. The goal was absolute. Saladin wasn't looking for a skirmish. He was marching to erase the Crusader presence from the Levant forever. The march began from Egypt, a tide of 30,000 souls fueled by a decade of planning and the certainty of total victory. Saladin's overconfidence was his only weakness. He believed the Ghost King would never dare to leave his walls. He was wrong. With the Sultan at the gates, the boy king issued the Arriere ban, a final, desperate summons to every man who could hold a sword. He rode south with a pittance of a force, just 375 knights. On paper, it was a suicide mission. At his side was Reynald of Chatillon, the aggressive lord of Ultra-Jourdain, a man whose thirst for war was as legendary as his cruelty. They raced for the fortress of Ascalon, hoping to intercept Saladin before he reached the heart of the kingdom. Every hour mattered. Baldwin knew he was walking into a trap, but he also knew that if he didn't act, Jerusalem would fall by nightfall. The Ghost King was dying, but his resolve was iron. He was about to force Saladin into a fight the Sultan never expected. Upon reaching the frontier, Baldwin found himself hopelessly outmatched. Saladin's vanguard pinned the king behind the walls of Ascalon. To the south, the Knights Templar were cut off at Gaza. Saladin was convinced the Christian threat was neutralized. The board was cleared. Believing his victory absolute, the Sultan made a fateful choice. He bypassed the fortresses and marched his massive column directly toward Jerusalem. But he allowed his host to scatter. Believing the hunt was over, his soldiers dispersed across the countryside to pillage and forage. Primary sources tell of Saladin's contempt. He moved with the slow, heavy step of a predator who thinks the prey is already dead. It was a perfect plan on paper, but Saladin had forgotten the first rule of war: never turn your back on a desperate king. Contempt is a dangerous lens. The Sultan didn't just underestimate the king, he stopped seeing him as a threat entirely. The chronicler Ibn al-Athir records that Saladin showed contempt for the Frankish force. His army became a column spread over miles, losing all tactical cohesion. His men were no longer warriors, they were porters. Burdened with loot and captives, they moved slowly, their eyes on their prizes rather than the horizon. Their horses were spent, exhausted from the rapid forced march from Egypt. The Ayyubid host was a giant with leaden feet, struggling through the coastal mud. Saladin had turned his elite force into a sitting target. He believed the Ghost King was still locked behind the gates of Ascalon. But while the Sultan looked toward Jerusalem, Baldwin was already behind him. The hunter had become the hunted. While Saladin looked toward the spires of Jerusalem, the Ghost King was planning a disappearance. Under the cover of a sudden violent storm, the Crusader force saw their window. The weather that blinded Saladin's scouts became Baldwin's greatest ally. Baldwin and 80 Knights Templar slipped out of Ascalon's shadow. They were moving light, moving fast, and most importantly, they were invisible. Using local knowledge of the marshes, they shadowed the Sultan's army from the north. They weren't just escaping, they were positioning the spear. They were the ghosts in the mist, watching as Saladin's massive, disorganized host stretched itself thin across the coastal plain. The Molk was being prepared. A sacrifice of position for the ultimate miracle of tactical surprise. The trap was about to snap shut. In warfare, geography is often the final judge. On this day, the judge was made of mud and stone. The Crusaders occupied the high ground of Tel Jazar. Below them lay a strategic bottleneck, where Saladin's superior numbers became a curse. Recent rains had turned the marshy ground into a quagmire. Saladin's baggage train was heavy and his horses were sinking into the coastal clay. The Sultan's light cavalry, famous for their speed, were now immobile. They were a giant trapped in a narrow hall, unable to turn or defend. The very host that was meant to crush Jerusalem was now a stationary target, its mobility sacrificed to the very earth they sought to conquer. The landscape was ready. The Ghost King had his bottleneck. Now all he needed was the spark to ignite the slaughter. Tactical positioning and geography were ready, but Baldwin knew that to win he needed more than mud. He needed a miracle. The Bishop of Bethlehem rode forward, lifting the relic of the true cross high above the ranks. It was the iron tip of their spiritual spear. Baldwin, his body a map of pain, did the unthinkable. He dismounted his horse and collapsed into the desert sand, prostrating himself before the wood of the cross. He prayed for intervention, for the strength to save a kingdom that was already mourning him. In that silence, the fear of death was replaced by something else. The sight of their dying king in the dust galvanized his knights. 500 men were suddenly unified by a single burning purpose. They were ready to die for him. The ritual was complete. The Ghost King had his soldiers' souls. Now he would unleash them upon Saladin's disorganized host. Baldwin's army was tiny, but its organization was surgical. He didn't just have soldiers, he had specialists. The vanguard was led by the Ibelin brothers, Baldwin and Balian. They were fighting on their own ancestral lands, and they knew every inch of the terrain. The army was split into 3 divisions. Behind the Ibelins stood the king's main body and the iron tip of the spear, 80 Knights Templar. These weren't just knights. They were the most elite fighting force in the Levant, sworn to a life of service and a death of glory. They were positioned at the very front of the column, ready to punch a hole through the disorganized heart of the Ayyubid host. The pieces were on the board. The Ghost King was ready to play his hand. Surprise was now his only path to victory. The souls were galvanized. Now, the Ghost King unleashed the storm. From the high ground of Tel Jazar, the heavy cavalry began their descent. It wasn't a slow approach. It was a sudden, violent work of gravity. Shock warfare was the hallmark of the West. Armored knights moving as one, accelerating into the valley with enough momentum to break any line. The 80 Templars were the iron tip of the spear. They struck first, smashing through the Ayyubid picket lines like a hammer through glass. Saladin's men were caught in their tents, mid-meal, mid-loot. There were no ranks to form, no time to react. Only the thunder of incoming death. In a single afternoon, the tide of the entire invasion was turned. The predator had been blindsided by its prey. Impact is only the beginning. True victory requires the total disintegration of the enemy's will to stand. Saladin's nephew, Taqi al-Din, attempted to rally a defense. He was a seasoned commander, trying to hold a wall of sand against a tide of steel. But his son, Ahmad, was killed in the first few minutes of the clash. The sight of the commander's blood in the dirt sent a shockwave through the ranks. The Ayyubid center disintegrated. They weren't just outfought, they were physically crushed by the sheer mass of the Frankish armored charge. Morale is a fragile thing. Once the center broke, the Sultan's invincible host became a panicked crowd with nowhere to hide and no way to reform. The heart of Saladin's army was gone. Now, only one thing remained between the boy king and the Sultan's head: the elite Mamluk guard. When the center broke, only one obstacle remained between the Crusaders and the Sultan himself: a wall of human steel. 1,000 Mamluks, elite slave soldiers, formed a tight circle around Saladin. They were the finest warriors in the Ayyubid Empire, sworn to die before they let their master fall. They fought with a desperate, suicidal bravery. As their comrades fled, the guard stood their ground, turning the sand into a meat grinder of iron and blood. Saladin watched as his most loyal men were cut down in waves. The guard wasn't fighting for victory anymore. They were fighting for time. Every second they held was a second the Sultan could use to escape. But the momentum of the Frankish charge was unstoppable. The Mamluk wall was shattered, its elite ranks slaughtered where they stood. The circle was broken. Saladin was now exposed. For the first time in his career, the invincible Sultan faced the very real possibility of capture or death. The lion of the desert was no longer hunting. For the first time in his life, he was the prey. Saladin, the invincible Sultan, only avoided capture by fleeing the field on a racing camel. He rode with the speed of a man who could hear the hooves of death. He left everything behind, his baggage, his personal treasury, and the prestige he had spent a decade building. His legacy was sinking into the mud of Montgisard. Behind him, his elite guard was being systematically slaughtered. They didn't fight for a kingdom, they fought to buy their master one more mile of desert. The Crusaders were only minutes behind. The Ghost King had nearly caught the Sultan's shadow, but the desert mist began to swallow the trail. Saladin survived the afternoon, but he was wounded in a way no doctor could fix. His myth of invincibility was dead. Victory at the hill was only the beginning. For the Ghost King, the slaughter wasn't over until the desert swallowed the last of the Sultan's host. Baldwin's knights, fueled by the adrenaline of a miracle, pursued the fleeing remnants for 12 grueling miles. They were the iron ghosts of the coastal plain. They recaptured everything. The vast amounts of gold, the mountains of silk, and the thousands of Christian captives Saladin had taken, all were reclaimed in the chaos of the retreat. The pursuit turned the retreat into a massacre. Caught against the marshes and the rising tide, thousands more of Saladin's men were cut down in the fading light. On the map, it was a straight line of iron driving into the heart of a broken empire. Baldwin was ensuring that Saladin would not return for a generation. The pursuit ended only when the darkness became total. The boy king had won more than a battle. He had erased an army. For Saladin, the nightmare didn't end at Montgisard. The desert he called home was about to turn against him. A freak rainstorm transformed the retreat into a slow-motion death march. The sand became a quagmire, trapping the weary and the wounded in a landscape of black clay. They were never alone. Bedouin tribes, sensing weakness, shadowed the retreat, harassing the Sultan's remnants like wolves around a dying giant. Exposure, hunger, and disease claimed thousands more. The Sultan's elite host was being eroded by the very elements they had marched through with such confidence weeks before. The march back to Cairo was a trail of bones. Chroniclers record a grim statistic. Of the 26,000 who set out, only 1/10 lived to see the Nile. Saladin returned to Egypt with his life, but his legend was shattered. The Ghost King had done more than win a battle. He had broken an empire's heart. Victory is never free. Behind every miracle is a ledger written in blood and the cold mathematics of the aftermath. The Crusaders paid a high price for their survival. Sources record 1,100 killed and nearly 800 wounded, a devastating loss for such a small force. But for Saladin, the numbers were a catastrophe. His field army, the heart of his power, had been erased. He had lost more than men. He had lost his aura of destiny. The loss was so absolute that Saladin did the only thing a ruler could. He suppressed it. He forbade his own chroniclers from discussing the battle for years. He needed to protect his prestige to keep his empire together. But the desert doesn't keep secrets. The trail of bones back to Egypt spoke louder than any scribe. Baldwin had won, but the boy king knew his time was running out. He had traded 1,000 lives for a decade of peace, a tactical Molk of the highest order. A miracle requires more than memory. It requires a monument. Baldwin IV intended to carve his victory into the very stone of the Holy Land. To commemorate the slaughter, the king ordered the construction of a Benedictine monastery on the site. He would turn a field of blood into a sanctuary of prayer. He dedicated it to St. Catherine of Alexandria. The battle had been won on her feast day, November 25th, and Baldwin saw her hand in the Sultan's defeat. The monastery stood as a permanent witness to the Ghost King's resolve. It was a physical rebuke to the black propaganda that called his rule a curse. For centuries, the monks prayed where knights had charged. The physical structure is largely gone, but the ground itself remains a map of the boy king's greatest hour. Baldwin's stone is weathered, but his legend was now set in something more durable than rock. The miracle had become a matter of historical fact. Montgisard was a tactical miracle, but in the grand game of empires, it was something else. It was bought time, 10 years to be exact. The Sultan's myth of invincibility was shattered. Saladin was forced to retreat into a cautious war of attrition, knowing now that the Leper King was a predator in his own right. But the victory was a double-edged sword. It lulled the Western powers into a fatal complacency. They believed the small local garrisons could hold off the Sultan forever. While the West celebrated, Saladin was learning. He was unifying his people, healing his wounds, and waiting for the moment the boy king's body finally gave out. The miracle had provided a respite, not a cure. The strategic board was still tilted against Jerusalem, and the peace of Montgisard was only the calm before a much greater storm. Victory had been won in the sand, but the kingdom was lost in the courtrooms of Europe. Complacency, it turns out, is more lethal than any army. Primary sources. Every miracle has two authors. To understand Montgisard, we must look through the eyes of the men who recorded it. William of Tyre, the king's own tutor, saw only the hand of God. To him, Baldwin's failing body was a vessel for divine power, a boy king used by heaven to strike down a giant. But in the courts of the East, the chronicler Ibn al-Athir told a different story. He saw no miracle, only the tactical arrogance of emirs who allowed their pride to outpace their discipline. Ibn al-Athir recorded the defeat as a necessary test of faith, a catalyst that would eventually force Saladin to unify the Islamic world before his final redemption at Hattin. The Latin records celebrate a saint. The Arabic records analyze a strategic error. Between these two truths lies the reality of what happened on that bloody afternoon. One event, two stories. History isn't just what happened, it's how we choose to remember the sacrifice. The Battle of Montgisard was more than a tactical upset. It was the final testament of a man who refused to be defined by his disease. Baldwin IV proved that a failing body could still house a mind sharp enough to dismantle the greatest military leader of the era. His spirit commanded a loyalty no curse could break. He bought his kingdom a decade of survival, 10 years where the bells of Jerusalem rang because of a 16-year-old boy who could barely hold his reins. For Saladin, it was a bitter seed. He would eventually find his redemption at Hattin, but he would never forget the afternoon he was outplayed by a ghost. The miracle of Montgisard remains a beacon in the dark chronicles of the Crusades, a moment when the impossible became a matter of historical fact. History remembers the mask, but it should honor the man. The Ghost King had saved his people one last time,